Hello, I'm Larry Johnson, and welcome to Countercurrents. In this episode, we're talking to Colonel Doug Macgregor, and we're going to talk to Doug specifically about his memory of what Donald Trump did or did not do during his first term as president with respect to Ukraine and the implications for the current round of new talks between the Russians and Ukrainians, with the full understanding that the real problem here is NATO and the United States. Thanks for watching. Please hit the like and subscribe button, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. But for the benefit of people watching and maybe listening to this for the first time, what was your role in the first Trump administration?
Well, my role lasted a little less than 90 days. Now, during his administration, I did receive phone calls periodically from his special assistant who asked me what I thought about things. And then suddenly, when he finally decided to remove Esper as Secretary of Defense, along with some other people, I was called and said, would you be willing to serve in the administration? I said, sure. So then within a few hours, received another phone call, can you come immediately to the White House? And this was sort of first week of November, right after the election. So this would have been 6, 7, 8 November. And he said, well, I can't, you're not Senate confirmed, so I can't put you in as Secretary of Defense or put you in as anything that requires Senate confirmation. So then he said, what if you became Chief of Staff to the, temporary SecDef or whatever? And I looked at the special assistant and I said, I've done those jobs. That's ideal for someone who is 45 years old and is advancing in his career,
right.
Is willing to work 12 to 18 hours a day. I am not. So he laughed. He said, well, then what do we do? I said, well, that's up to you. And they came back with this idea of making me the senior advisor to the acting Secretary of Defense. But in truth, I was really there because Donald Trump at the time wanted to extricate us from Afghanistan, as well as from Syria and Iraq. And he knew that despite his efforts to push us in those directions, the people under him were disloyal to him and had not done anything to facilitate those outcomes. So, then the point was, well, see what you can do to reduce or eliminate our military presence in Europe, which is interesting. We're talking about something that's a little less than 90 days, like 70 days. And I said, well, I think you may be able to do one or two of those things, but nothing more. I said, oh, all right. And he went back to see Donald Trump. I sat in his office and waited in the executive office building at the time. He came back and said, okay, this is what you're going to do. And the focus was really extricate us from Afghanistan. So then I sat with everybody that was working for him. And I said, if you want to get out, it's a very straightforward matter. The president has to write an executive order that directs the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And they said, well, how rapidly could it be done? And I said, well, let me spend a couple of days in the building. Let me talk to all of the people that are there that I know who have experience on the ground, as well as some people who aren't, who'd served at least 1 or 2 tours in Afghanistan. And they all came back and said, oh, the best time to leave is in the dead of winter. If you leave in the dead of winter, all the people that might otherwise interfere with you or take shots at you will stay home. They'll be in the caves in the mountains, with their goats and other strange animals. And you can pretty much do what you want. I said, no, that was my impression. And I said, how long is it going to take us to fly and drive out? I said, well, probably if we decide to do it, 60 days, maybe 90. But, it's all a function of resolve. You're determined to do it. You want to get out, you can do it. I said, got it. So I went back, I drafted an executive order for his consideration. And I said, try to be out no later than the 21st of January, by the time you get a new president. This is the 8th or 9th of November, just before the 11th, as I recollect. And he took it, and I guess he loved it, but they decided to make it far simpler. They thought it was too detailed. And it was, I hereby direct the immediate withdrawal of all U.S. forces. And I had pointed out to them, look, you can leave people on the embassy staff. Mm-hmm. There are special ops and so forth to guarantee security and all this kind of business. So if you want to leave 50 or 100 people there to ensure that sort of thing, that's what you do. Oh, okay. I said, they said to me initially, what's an executive order look like? And I said, well, you've got drawers full of them over here. Pull one out, model it. Well, who does it go to? I said, well, look at a recent one and then look at the distribution where you want it to go. I was astonished at how little understanding there was of the mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, they did it. He did sign it, and they got the distribution right. And this would have been Thursday afternoon, the day after the 11th. It was issued in the morning. Then all hell breaks loose. The Senate Armed Services Committee, key members of the Senate, as well as the acting Secretary of Defense, even though I put it in his inbox, he saw it. I said, here it is, because I wasn't there to work for him. He wasn't going to do anything. He went crazy. His acting chief of staff was Kash Patel, who kind of, and they all were called over to the White House by the end of the day. And finally, Mitch McConnell and I don't know who else was there from the Senate, plus the House, along with the acting Sec Def and his chief of staff, all said, we can't do this. We just can't do this. The allies, what do we do about the allies? And my answer was, if you leave, the allies will leave.
Yeah.
And you can often fly them out. You don't ask for permission. You're the commander in chief. You're the president of the United States. You're the leader of NATO. Well, Anyhow, bottom line is they talked him out of it. And he said, well, how many troops can I take out? They said, well, you can take out all, but I think they said something like 5,000. Well, you know what that was all about? Contractors.
Yes.
It was all about contractors. And they kept saying, well, we've negotiated arrangements with our allies and everyone else. We're supposed to stay there for another year or more, which means we're going to keep the money flowing. But I wasn't in the meeting and I didn't have the opportunity to speak. I did filter these comments back, but, ultimately President Trump, he buckled. And he said, okay, so they ended up taking out a few thousand troops and reducing it down to about 5,500. Then they made the decision, which I never thought of in my life, to leave from Kabul. I thought they would leave from the air base that we controlled, which would be much safer up in
Bagram.
Bagram. But I was never asked the details. Now, I did tell the Secretary of Defense that, if the acting one, if you're going to go down there, you need to personally hand the order to the CENTCOM commander. You're responsible. This is your mission. You need to direct the Joint Chiefs to support him and provide him whatever he needs.
Right.
This kind of thing. And I was saying, but you should go down there personally. And it all went away. There was no interest in doing anything. Everyone wanted the status quo to continue.
The failure of that planning process. I was fortunate in that, the 23 years I spent doing consulting with JSOC and SOCOM and writing exercises. The fellow that led our outfit, Colonel Larry Dugan, he was the last 06 to command SOCCENT. That was 1992. But he wrote JOPES. So that, that whole joint organization planning doctrine, he wrote it. And I mean, he knew it backwards and forwards.
Well, of course, the gentleman that carried the torch for no change on the military side was Milley. And they all said terrible things about me, that I was a rogue officer and on and on and on, and I should never have been allowed to do this, and it should have all gone through them. But I was sent there specifically because we know if you tried to put it through them, they would obstruct.
Yeah. No, they had those sinecures waiting for them once they retired, the prophet. In that brief time you were around Trump, did you pick up anything with respect to his policy views towards Ukraine, or was Ukraine just a backwater?
No, Ukraine was very definitely on the backside. There was no interest that I could detect in any of it. He was very focused on the forces we had in NATO. He felt strongly they should be dramatically reduced. He had very serious misgivings about continued membership in NATO. He asked me what I thought, and I told him, I said, I think the Europeans have to become their own first responders. That's the way it should be pitched. I also felt, and I've written this publicly for years, you should replace that Army 4-star or Air Force 4-star, whatever it turns out to be, with a European four-star. And you've got to compel the Europeans to make the investments in C4ISR so that the alliance is meaningful. He agreed, but it didn't make any difference because this was the 19th or 20th of April. I think it was roughly that when we spoke about these things. And that's when I was brought over to interview for a different job entirely. But he felt strongly that NATO was something that had been around too long, and we needed to do something different. So I knew that was the case. We did talk a little bit about Northeast Asia, and he said yes. He said the Japanese clearly don't need us to defend them. And at that point, he was not, in my judgment, very hostile at all to the Chinese. His view was, well, they're tough business partners, but, we'll do what we have to do business and so forth. I didn't see any evidence for any bellicosity. I saw no evidence for fear of or hostility to Russia. And at the end of the meeting I was in, and the interesting part is that the two people that were in the meeting with me were Esper, and this, of course, April, before he was removed, and O'Brien. And they spent most of the time cringing at all the answers that I was giving because the president kept asking me, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that? And I tell people what I think. I don't mince words and so forth. He said, well, why do you even want this job? And I think it was the old policy job, Undersecretary for Policy, that Wolfowitz had. And I said, well, sir, I'm like a lot of Americans. I'm very frustrated that your policies have been obstructed. I'd like to see you be successful. I agree with you. I think we need to make fundamental changes on a strategic level. And then O'Brien thought he was asking me a trick question. And he said, Mr. President, may I ask a question? And he said, sure, go ahead. And he said, what do you think are there any existential threats to the United States today beyond our borders? I said, absolutely. And he was looking at me and I said, the drug cartels in Mexico, and Mexico's an organized crime state. And if we don't deal decisively with the border, it's going to come back to haunt us in ways that we can't even imagine. That border is open and it's dangerous. Well, again, they went into the cringe mode because China, Russia,
yeah.
Iran. And the other thing is that I told him I thought that, the Iranians were people that he could deal with. And he said, yes, I think you're right. There's no reason for a war with them. I mean, the guy was very straightforward and I was straightforward with him. But, at the end of the day, the biggest challenge I think that the president has is how much does he actually know? I mean, does he know anything about the world beyond our borders? Well, he visits golf courses around the world.
Right.
But what else does he know? He mixes with lots of people that drive Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and giant yachts. What's that tell him about the rest of the world? This is the problem. People that drive Ferraris do not understand the lifestyle of people who drive VW Golfs.
Exactly. During your military career, did you spend most of your time with the CENTCOM, or did you move through the various commands?
No, the Army was a place where you served in one of two armies at any given point in time. One army was Europe, and the other army was the Pacific, Korea.
Okay.
And you would rotate back to the United States, and you would spend time there doing various things, and then rotate back to the European or to the Pacific theater. And so I was a Europeanist. All of my work was about Soviet, East German relations, politics, period. Everything that you can conceive of about the Soviet Union and Russia and Germany and Europe in general, that was my focus. So I ended up in the Middle East, fortunately, at a great point in time. I wasn't entirely unprepared for it because you can't study Europe without studying the Ottomans.
Right.
And subsequently what happens with Ataturk and the Middle East and Palestine. But that was really my focus, and it worked out very well with me. I had multiple tours in Europe, and one of the reasons that General Wes Clark brought me over was that I got along so well with Europeans. Most Americans don't. He certainly did not. And he saw that I could, and it worked out brilliantly for me because I do.
Do you recall, were you involved in any of the NATO or U.S. UCOM exercises after 1995 that took place in Ukraine or with Ukraine?
And no, not really, because by then I was involved in the Balkans, primarily in Bosnia Herzegovina. I was brought in by again General Clark to help with the Dayton Accords, and he sent me over there where I spent a little over 30 days driving all over Bosnia Herzegovina in an armored Ford Fairlane 500 that was driven by one of my Ranger buddies. This was a Sergeant Schoenberger. And he and I went through Winter Ranger together. So he was driving and he had one of these. We had arms, obviously, weapons, and we had some near difficult experiences with the Serbs, which is kind of a funny story. But anyway, I drove all over the place. And the idea was that I could come back and then try to make intelligent decisions to draw the new borders between the Bosniaks and the Serbs, and potentially Croats as well, but more Serbs, that would be militarily advantageous to the Bosniaks. Well, we did the best we could, and General Clark said, you got to get this right and so forth. But I said, sir, every time we try to do something, we have Mr. Izetbegovic, the Bosniak leader, who would say, well, that village has to be ours, and that's beyond the border. And I would say, well, sir, that village is indefensible. But she didn't have any choice. She had to change it to satisfy the people. And it went on. It was an interesting experience to be locked up with all of these people for 3 weeks just before Thanksgiving in 1995. So that's where I was focused. I came back again in January of 96. And at the time, it was my war college year. But I spent it as a fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Oh, okay.
So what I did in the spring was then write Breaking the Phalanx, which of course endeared me to all the senior ranks. They were so grateful for my recommendations. But I was not looking carefully, although I saw Ukrainians in Bosnia Herzegovina. They were there as part of the UN thing. And it was striking to me because I spoke some Ukrainian. I grew up with Ukrainians who were from the west of Ukraine, near Lvov, in those areas. And I spoke some Ukrainian. This man looked at me and said, that is not Ukrainian. That is Polish. Well, it wasn't Polish, but you've got a lot of Polish and German mixed in with the Ukrainian in the West.
Yeah.
And the people that come from the middle have a sort of a halfway house between Ukrainian and Russian. The people in the East are all speaking Russian. So that was my first introduction. And then I did start to pay attention to Ukraine because I saw it as a disaster waiting to happen. It's not a nation in the sense that Russia is a nation.
Yeah.
It's too mixed. It's too incoherent. It's not cohesive.
Well, when I started thinking, again, with my experience working the special operations world on the military exercises, but they're always done with the theater sinks because there was a requirement that every, UCOM, now Indo-PACOM, then PACOM, Southcom, AFRICOM, everyone had to conduct a counterterrorism exercise every year. And so I was involved with scripting all of those and executing all of those, and began to get an understanding of, my mentor at State Department, my immediate boss. He left the Marine Corps as an 06. He had been commanded the 5th Marines, and he was, he was an old school, hard as woodpecker lips guy. But, he was the one that sort of mentored me on the role of training and exercises, and that this is not just people out trying to get some physical activity in. This is that you're either in a fight or you're training to be in a fight, and there shouldn't be any in between.
Well, you must have had something to do with General Van Riper, who was always one of my favorite people because he exposed most of these exercises as farcical.
Oh, yeah.
Because they simply weren't real. That was my criticism inside the Army. I said the same damn thing.
Well, the thing we always heard at the end of the exercises was, this was the best exercise ever, and lessons learned. And they'd write down the lessons learned. And when I started out, I thought, oh man, this is great. We're going to be learning. We're going to be building knowledge on knowledge. And then I realized if it's not flat, it's a diminishing learning curve. Nobody learned a damn thing. And it was constantly reinvention of the wheel.
Yeah, I think you can bet on that sort of thing. Everything is scripted. It's very reminiscent of the French army exercises before the Second World War. All through the 30s, those exercises were scripted and, of course, based on the methodical battle, which had been learned in the last year of war. Well, I guess the last 2 years. So it's unfortunate. We have no real general staff.
Yeah.
There's nobody educated and trained to do that kind of work. And there's nobody who wants one because that would involve potentially merit. That's unwelcome. I don't see that in any of the services. What I do see, and I give the Air Force and the Navy credit, because in the Navy you have to take a ship out and bring it back without losing it.
Yeah.
That demands some technical skill, and keeps people in and the water out. That's not a small matter, believe me. And I also saw technical expertise in the Air Force, particularly the people that flew, understood the weapon systems, what they were delivering in the aircraft, and their limitations. There's nothing in the Army. I never saw anything in the Marine Corps other than the senior man president is the smartest man in the room. Now, if that's changed and somewhere or another, they're all Renaissance men now, let me know. But I was unimpressed with both the Army and the Marines. Not with the soldiers or Marines. They were pretty good. Or the NCOs, but and individually, the thing I found with them is individually, you're dealing with an intelligent person, but as soon as you get them in a herd, they lose it all.
Yeah.
And the Marines, well, the commandant says, and I would when I was a consultant, I said, well, what if the commandant is wrong? That was incomprehensible. And at the time, this was 2005, and I represented a certain defense industry that I won't name, but I was arguing for light to medium weight armor with serious firepower that was needed in Anbar province. And I said, look, you got 4,000 casualties. You can't sandbag 50 caliber machine guns and fight this out like it's World War I.
Yeah.
You need this. And this giant expeditionary fighting vehicle, remember that monster, the old one, that was a catastrophe on land. I said, that's not what you need. Well, we're Marines and we have to be ready to go. And I said, okay, fine. I don't care. I said, I think you need this. And then somebody said, well, we're going to get the EFV. Well, I knew from the EFV, the people on the team and the way that thing was emerging, it was never going to show up. So they said the EFV and the V-22 are the future. That's what the commandant says. That's what's going to happen. I said, okay, good luck.
Yeah.
And I tried to get them to look at a strategic hedge against the high probability of failure of one of those programs. And of course, Cheney was right. I mean, you got to give Dick Cheney credit. He thought the B-22 was a disaster. I think it's been terrible. It's killed too many of our own Marines. It's another contraption that wasn't made to fly.
Right.
But it does.
Yeah.
So anyhow.
Combines the worst of fixed wing with rotary wing.
Yeah, exactly. So anyhow.
Well, when I started digging into, the question came up on my mind, when did we really start our exercise program with Ukraine? And as I dug into it, I was shocked to discover that the program really started actively in 95. By 1997, we were using Yavoriv, that base that's in western Ukraine, as a de facto NATO headquarters.
Mm-hmm.
And I came to the realization that Ukraine was a de facto member of NATO. The only thing they didn't have was Article 5 status and a requirement to kick in money every year. But then when I asked the further question and got the answer about, by 2007, 2008, there were 28 NATO members. And I said, how many countries have hosted, without specifying NATO countries, just how many countries have hosted the most NATO, U.S., UCOM military exercises? The answer that came back out of ChatGPT was number 6 on the list was Ukraine. I went, what? So that means 23 other NATO countries didn't host as many exercises as Ukraine had alone.
Well, you know that Poland was brought in 1999.
Right.
And this is actually during the Kosovo air campaign, which was something of a disaster, contrary to what everybody would like to think.
Yeah, it was 2 weeks before.
Yeah. And there were a lot of us that liked that. I mean, the Poles are charming people. A lot of us liked them. The Germans worked tirelessly to help the Poles because I think they felt they had some sort of moral obligation to help them. But a lot of people at the time who were Europeans said, is this really a good idea? The Poles really hate the Russians.
Mm-hmm.
And there were, behind closed doors, senior European general officers expressed that sentiment, said, this may not be a good idea. But it went through. Clinton, of course, signed on immediately, and that had more to do, I think, with his domestic political aspirations than anything else. And of course, he didn't really know much about it. I mean, this is the problem. Presidents, we pick them not on the basis of required knowledge or experience. In other words, what should every president know something about? Well, he should know something about economics and how the economy functions. He should know something about the international system and the key figures in it. And finally, should have some knowledge of the armed forces, how they are developed and staffed and so forth. And then he should have some domestic political experience. Well, guess what everybody's got? Domestic political experience.
Yeah.
You start asking them any hard questions about the rest of it. Well, we have the Council of Economic Advisors. Well, that may not be good enough. You may really want to weigh into this to understand how it works. And I think to some extent, President Trump takes the position that if I really need to know something in depth, I can turn to someone on my staff.
Mm-hmm.
Bonaparte was certainly a success story up until the bitter end. And he didn't do that. He didn't depend on the staff officer to tell him everything. Nobody who's ever been victorious in battle repeatedly in the military has ever done that. MacArthur was his own best intelligence officer, and he was always right. So I don't think there's an understanding of the importance of those other three attributes. And who sat down and wrote this note about these attributes? It was Eisenhower.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the things that they don't teach at the War College, they should, he was not a very good general officer. He was in way over his head. In fact, if you go to the British General Staff and you look at Alan Brooks' comments, the unexpurgated version of his papers, he picks MacArthur out early and he says, this is the best general of the war. If only he were here in Europe, things would be different. But he wasn't. But in Eisenhower's defense, he learned.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't repeat mistakes. When he recognized he'd made a mistake, he learned from it, never did it again. And he met everybody. And he understood everybody, including people like Stalin and Zhukov and Molotov and so forth. That made a huge difference. And so when he was leaving, he sat down and said, these are the four general areas where there has to be some understanding. And remember, he held defense spending in check. He cut it way back in many cases, canceled programs left and right that he knew were just gold-plated dinosaurs designed to make people rich. And he was hated for it. Everybody hated Eisenhower in the building. The Joint Chiefs had to have lunch with him once a month, and they hated it because he asked all the hard questions. So, we don't get it. And so you just get, in my estimation, in most cases, one amateur after the next.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know what the hell they're doing.
And they're easily sort of guided, because the reason I was asking you about any experience with military exercises in Ukraine during Trump's first term is that during Trump's first term, the exercises take what I'll call a decided offensive cast. In other words, it was only the previous year that they did anti-submarine warfare. But in 2017, for the first time, they did amphibious warfare, which involved Marines in landing craft landing on the shores of the Black Sea. I mean, can you imagine how we'd react if the Russians were doing that with the Mexicans in the Gulf of America?
Well, President Trump, I don't think paid much attention to that. If you'll recall, he actually held up aid for Ukraine at one point. One of the reasons he gave, which wasn't really the reason in my judgment, but he said, I thought we were only providing them with defensive weapons.
Mm-hmm.
Then he turned around and approved the Javelin because he said, well, that's a defensive weapon. Then he bragged about giving them all Javelins. Now the Javelins are with the drug cartels in Mexico. They've been so successful. I don't think he looked carefully at that. I think instead he was looking at what he wanted to achieve domestically. And one of the ways you do that is that you take positions on other areas that are important to certain members to drive them to support you at home.
Yeah.
Oh, you don't like what we're doing? Well, we're going to close your base in northern Maine. You're not going to get any new F-35s. Next, this sort of thing.
The ability, I guess, let's call it the deep state, making a lot of these decisions with respect to Ukraine. In September of 2020, somebody at the Pentagon or in the U.S. UCOM chain of command thought it was a real great idea to have B-52s fly along the Crimea coast as part of one of these exercises.
Well, the good idea is the United States Air Force. You got to understand something. From their standpoint, that's a marketing exercise. And the Air Force, and I like the officers, and I've known a lot of them, but their view is that whatever they do is perfect, whatever they do succeeds, and they have won all of our wars for them. And they take that position because they say aerospace power is so important to this country that if anyone subtracts anything from the budget, it puts the very existence of America at risk. Therefore, we can lie about the things that we hit or didn't hit. We can lie whatever we want, whatever we say is justified. That's how important aerospace power is.
Yeah. So when you hear Vladimir Putin say, okay, we'll negotiate, but we got to get to the root causes, what's your understanding of what the Russians see as the root causes?
I think the Russians see us as the root cause, to be blunt. I don't think there's any debate about that. Does anybody really think the people that came to power in 2014 would have come to power without our interference?
Right. Yeah.
Russians know that. And they know that we have been there before. We were there after the Second World War, supporting the Ukrainian insurgents against the Soviets, which, by the way, those Ukrainian insurgents did a pretty damn good job. I met some of them. They're dead now, but they were from the Carpathian Ukraine, and they were tough hombres. They made life miserable. And by the way, Yaroselsky, the general, he endeared himself to the Soviets by helping the Russians to hunt down these Ukrainians and kill them. And the problems never really went away. In 1968, they tried to mobilize Ukrainian troops from the western part of Ukraine in that military district. 1 in 10 showed up. Just stop, think about that. So that has been there from the beginning. And this is something that Vladimir Putin understands. He knows the history of his own country. He doesn't want to rule those people. He doesn't want to go near it. That is as dumb as trying to take in Poles. And so all this nonsense about conquering Eastern Europe is just complete crap. There's no basis in fact. But I think that the bottom line is that the Russians see us as the principal culprit, and they were hoping that President Trump would recognize what really happened, that there was no legitimacy to this attack on Russia, which is really what the whole place is about, and he would end the aid to them, which is why I have repeated myself for months saying President Trump just needs to stop the aid, withdraw all U.S. personnel, military, civilian, intelligence, whatever. That's all you have to do. And this war will end, and it will sort itself out. And we can always host a conference, but let the European neighbors of Russia sit down with Russia and sort through this. He's been talked out of that repeatedly. Instead, you get the Kellogg approach, which says the Russians are evil, the Russians are bad, they want to advance, we have to stop them. So we can't do anything until they agree to essentially withdraw from some territory they've taken and stop fighting. Well, that's absurd. Why would the Russians?
Have you heard any of the reports that have come out of today's meeting in Istanbul?
Well, I heard something a few hours ago where it was quite short. But beyond that, the Russians said they thought there were some useful points discussed, and then I went to the gym. So no.
Okay, let me give you a quick rundown. Medinsky, so they did agree to swap prisoners at a rate of 1 to 1, up to 1,000.
Yeah.
But then, Medinsky basically sat down and said, look, here's our deal for you. Withdraw all Ukrainian forces from Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk. And then we'll talk about the possibility of a ceasefire. And then the Ukrainians said, well, hell no, we're not going to do that. And then Medinsky said, well, that's our offer. If you don't do that, we're going to take 4 more. In other words, then Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkiv, Poltava, and Sumy. They're going to go all the way up to the east bank of the Dnieper. And they'll take it. And he said, well, he did say, I don't care. He says, if we have to fight for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 20, he says, as long as it takes, this is what we're going to do. We're going to secure ourselves.
Yeah. No, I absolutely. I think that handwriting was on the wall early. The opportunity in April of 2022 was real to have ended this thing, come to some sort of an arrangement. It didn't happen. And so they've been fighting ever since. And you and I know, how can you accuse the Russians of readying and organizing to invade Eastern Europe when they move into Ukraine and discover, my God, there are 800,000 people over here. This is the standing force plus reservists. They all have excellent training and they have excellent equipment. This is going to take us a lot longer than we thought. And so they step back, they do what is required, and here we stand. They've done those things. They've just brought in another 135,000 troops.
Right.
Now, those are not going to go in immediately, but they're available. And from the very beginning, I always said our interests historically, the United States and Europe, if you want to call them interests, they begin at the Dnieper River.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, if a large Russian army crosses into Western Ukraine, alarm bells go off.
Yeah.
That's a consequence. But what happens east of that river is not our affair. Right. It never has been.
Well, and I think you're exactly right that the Russians, I think they will take Kiev just because of its historical significance. But they're not going to go venturing out into Lviv and all those areas that are out. They'll let the Poles and the Romanians and the Hungarians fight it out over that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the Russians would be happy to meet. And if the Romanians, the Poles, the Lithuanians, even to some extent want to get involved, then they'll entertain it. Of course, the Lithuanians want Minsk because that historically, there used to be a giant pylon in Minsk in 3 languages. I think it was in Latin, and then written in Cyrillic, Russian, and Lithuanian, and it said, "Here begins Lithuania." Yeah, well, the problem is, gentlemen, I know you were there for hundreds of years, but you lost it. But everybody in Lithuania wants to get it back. There are still some Lithuanians left over there, but they keep quietly to themselves. But I think that certainly if the Poles want to go in and deal with these unhappy Ukrainians, I think the Russians will let them go in. And of course, they'd laugh all the way in because these Ukrainians and Poles aren't going to get along.
Right.
I never saw peace between them and North Philadelphia.
Oh, boy.
What a strange world, So the whole thing about NATO, though, is bottom line is that President Trump understands that NATO has run its course. What he's never figured out is how to get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, how do we gradually move out and relinquish this leadership role and get the Europeans to step up? He's never been able to do that because nobody around him will help him do it.
Yeah, and that's, I think that's the key takeaway from, just your own experience, pointing out that no matter what Trump thinks, and even in his heart of hearts, you've got this bureaucracy underneath him and around him that can easily either stall, interfere, delay, or thwart what he wants to get done.
And he's also never understood something else. Shoot 1, educate 1 million. That's a comment from Mao. In other words, take over, pick out the 10 people you want to make examples of, and execute. Be done with it. The people that rise to the top of the military, they tend on the whole to blow with the wind. They're
Yeah.
So once they see, whoops, look what happened to Joe and Bob and Sam. Oh, well, things have changed. But you can't do things piecemeal. You also need a strategy. You need a plan.
Well,
Where is it?
yeah. Well,
I don't see any.
let me lay out. I wrote a piece last night. I don't think you've had a chance to see it. I started asking myself the question. I wonder how did the literacy rate in China, Russia, and the United States change from 1925 to 2024 in the 100 years? And you got into it in China in like 1925, it was 10% literacy rate. By 1955, it was 20%. But by 2024, 98, 99%. Russia went from like 25% in 25 to 97% in 55, and they're still up at 99%. The United States was at like 50% in 1925, went up to 97% 1955. What do you think our literacy rate is now?
80%.
74%.
Well, Larry, this is another sore subject, but it does matter whom you admit to your country.
Oh, absolutely. If
In
nothing
fact, I would tell you that we had a much higher literacy rate in 1900 than most countries because all of the immigrants that came in were educated.
Yeah.
They could read and write when they got here. And we brought in some really good people up until about, I would say, just before World War I. Then people got nervous. They saw a lot of criminality. They saw a lot of Communist Party members. And that's why we shut it all down in 1924. But then we had something else called the public school system. And that was initially devised to turn the children of immigrants, recent immigrants, into Americans.
Yeah, yeah.
It worked.
Yeah.
And we had tens of thousands of these people that were recently born in the United States and became fanatical Americans.
Yeah.
I was listening to it was the brother of Sly Stallone,
Uh-huh.
talking about in the neighborhood where he grew up, which was primarily Italian with some Irish and a few other mixed in, said Flag Day, every flag was out. Every holiday, every flag was out. Everybody went into the military. When World War II came, when Korea came, everybody served. That's what I grew up with in the 1950s. I mean, it was so radically different. We had a cohesive society. We were Americans. We knew who the hell we were.
Exactly.
And what are we now?
Yeah. No, and that's the danger. In fact, I'll leave you with this last statistic. Of that 74% literacy rate, they said that 54% of the adults read at a 6th grade level or lower. I mean, and we're going to compete with Russia and China. I mean, it's shocking. Yeah. Anyway, hey, Doug, listen, I appreciate your time for doing this. There's nothing like, you've been there, you've seen it from the front, and we need to get your voice out there more often.
Well, Larry, you've been of enormous help because you've really immersed yourself in the details tactically of what goes on over in Ukraine. And I have sort of walked away from that. I got tired of it.
Yeah.
I had so many other things to think about. I think Brian Berletic is another man who does a very fine job on that sort of thing.
Yeah, I agree.
I just hope that we are paying attention and learn something from what the Russians have done.
Yeah, well, just with respect to me, it's your taxpayer dollars at work. CIA trained me to do that.
Well,
right, hey, thanks so much.
Right. Bye-bye.
Well, that concludes our discussion with Doug. Thanks for watching. Please hit the like and subscribe button and share it with your friends. I'm Larry Johnson, and this is the latest episode of Countercurrents. Thank you.